Hello, you're watching Fed by Splendour, a podcast where we discuss life and faith through the lens of the Catholic Church. Now, as Catholics, we know about the veneration of saints, but have you heard of the veneration of ancestors before? Today, we will be discussing about this topic. I'm Jennifer, your host for this podcast, and joining me on board this conversation is Deacon Sherman Quack. Hey, Deacon.
Hi, Jen.
Hi, Blessed Land.
Blessed land. So, since it's land, no alcohol lah. Water only.
Mine also water only.
So what exactly are we talking about today? Veneration of ancestors.
Yeah, so it is Lent now, but I would like to talk about something that happened not too long ago, which is, as you say, the veneration, and I also said the veneration of ancestors, which occurs.
I thought you would be asking me what I'm doing for Lent, what I'm giving up for Lent.
Maybe next one lah, next podcast. But this one, let's talk about something recently happened one, okay? Veneration of ancestors. So this occurs during Chinese New Year or Lunar New Year, which was just a month ago. And this happens among some parishes here in Malaysia, right? And honestly, I've never seen this practice with my own eyes before, but I did notice for at least 10 years. Every Chinese New Year, there's bound to be some pictures on social media of priests, mostly from West Malaysia, doing this ancestral veneration thing during the Chinese New Year masses. And there would be very strong negative reactions from people on social media towards these pictures. So many of them feel that it contradicts the faith of the Catholic Church. Now, being from East Malaysia, I'm not familiar with what this rite is all about, what it involves, and why it provokes so much reaction. It's something that happens every Chinese New Year without fail. So I decided I should have a chat with you about this, Deacon. Can you tell us what this rite is about and what do you think about it? And why are people reacting so strongly about it?
Yeah, you bring up easier topics, can or not? Well, this rite of veneration of ancestors, undoubtedly, I think it has caused a lot of controversy. We can't deny that, especially on social media. You are right, that every Chinese New Year, at least in the last 10 years, at least in the last 10 years that I have started observing, every Chinese New Year, it becomes a big issue of controversy on social media. So you are right, that it has riled up a lot of people. But actually, when you brought this topic up, I was also a little tense because I must admit that I almost fear to talk about this matter because when I wrote about it about 10 years ago in 2012, my article or what I wrote caused a bit of a political backlash. And I don't mean in secular politics, but I mean in church politics, it caused quite a bit of backlash against me by some of the authorities in the church. So I have since then been very hesitant to talk about it. But now that you're bringing it up, I suppose it's something that we need to discuss and think about further in a level-headed way. But you know me I'm as a deacon, I've always been the kind who doesn't want to get involved in any kind of church politics. For me, we just talk about issues, and I think about these issues pastorally, think about these issues theologically, and then we try to be as level-headed as possible on these matters. So rather than being personal about things, but at the same time, I do understand that this matter is a very personal matter for many people. So I suppose before we even start our conversation about this, it's wise and prudent of me to clarify that I am speaking on this matter not representing the magisterium. That means what I say doesn't represent the bishops. It doesn't represent the Catholic Church as a whole. I'm speaking purely as a theologian, someone who's thinking from a theological perspective, and also someone who's involved in pastoral work and who's involved in the lives of the people. So I might be saying certain things that may reflect how some or perhaps many people think about this issue. So you will realize that when I talk about these matters, right, I will end up asking more questions than stating a strong opinion on the matter. So I admit at the outset, I have more questions than opinions or answers on this matter.
Okay, fair point. So let's approach this issue today from that perspective then, from your perspective as a theologian. But it is a matter that happens in the Catholic Church, right?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, it's all over social media, lah. So it's something that that there is no point denying, lah. We can't pretend that this thing is not found in the Catholic Church, lah. So
which begs the question: why is this such a big deal, isn't it?
Well, I suppose at the outset, it's important for us to understand where this practice comes from in the first place, right?
That's right, yes.
So yeah, actually, this matter of ancestral veneration has been a matter that is controversial, not just today, but it has been something controversial from 4 centuries ago, at least. Because, and it was known in the 17th century China as the Chinese rites controversy.
Right.
And this rite of ancestral veneration was something that was propagated by the Jesuit missionaries in 17th century China. You see, at that time, they found that many people in China, whom the Jesuits were trying to bring the gospel to, right? But they found that these people in China were very steep in their practice of ancestral veneration in their homes. That means they had tablets with the names of the ancestors on those wooden tablets, and perhaps jaw sticks in front of those tablets, as a way of venerating the ancestors. So the Jesuits actually propagated that these people who wanted to convert into the Catholic faith should be allowed to continue with these rites in the home, practicing these rites in their homes. Okay. And this practice, of course, although it was propagated by the Jesuit missionaries, it was very strongly opposed by the Franciscans, the Augustinians, and the Dominicans, right? And so in the course of the debate, 2 popes, Clement XI and Benedict XIV, these 2 popes outlawed the practice, and they said it's not to be allowed. But when it was outlawed, now the reason that they outlawed it, of course, was because they said that these practices are associated with the practice of, rather they said that this practice was associated with pagan religious rituals. It's what pagans do. So when you become Christians, you should not be doing this anymore. All right. So because of this, they outlawed this practice. But the problem was when they outlawed this practice, it caused a scandal among those who might have wanted to convert into the Catholic faith, because you're not allowing them to show respect to the memory of the ancestors. So because of that, it resulted in a drastic drop in the conversion rate among the prospective Catholics in China, right? So now this debate went on, and until the late 1930s, then Pope Pius XII, he issued an instruction to, from that time onwards, allow for this practice. And he was very clear about why he started allowing this practice. And he says that the purpose of allowing this practice is to remove hindrances to people accepting the gospel, right? Because by then, anyway, by the 1930s, ancestral veneration in China was actually not a pagan religious ritual, It was merely a social convention. People do that as a way to show their relatives, to show their friends, to show their family members that they are being filial to the ancestors who have passed on.
Right.
So it's not so much that they are praying to the ancestors who have passed on, or they are trying to communicate with them in some way,
This is in 1930s in China.
In the 1930s, yeah. So they were doing it to show, basically, socially, that they were being filial to the ancestors, whether it's their parents, grandparents, or great-grandparents. So because it has become a mere social convention, Pope Pius XII said, there is nothing wrong with this. There is no reason why an injunction should be laid to stop people from practicing this, and thereby also making it difficult for them to accept the gospel. Because it's like telling them, if you want to become Christian, then you must stop respecting the memory or honoring the memory of your ancestors, which doesn't sound very right, isn't it? Yeah, so that's why from the 1930s, it was allowed by the Pope. So, but this is just in the context of China, not in the context of Malaysia yet, right? This practice never came into Malaysia until the 1970s or 1980s. And it was not brought in from China, actually. It was brought in from Taiwan. It was brought in from Taiwan. And I've actually verified this with a priest who has now passed on. He was a very elderly priest, but I spoke to him about this about 10 years ago, asking him whether he knew who brought this practice into Malaysia. He said he knows who brought it in from into Malaysia. He said, but it was not practiced. It was not brought in from China. It was brought in from Taiwan. That means a Malaysian priest who went to Taiwan, learned it there, and then brought it into Malaysia. So when I asked him, what do you think about it? Well, this priest who is a missionary from China, he told me, he said, I never allowed my people to practice it here. So, for whatever reason, I'm not sure. Yeah, so the practice came into Malaysia in the 1970s, 1980s, but it wasn't from China. It came in through Taiwan, actually. Yeah. So, well, it became kind of an official thing. And I would say, I use the word official within inverted commas, within quotation marks. It became an official kind of practice in Malaysia, I think, in about the early 2000s, if I'm not mistaken, in 2002 or something like this, 2002. And it was published, of course, with the permission of the Archbishop at that time, the Metropolitan Archbishop of Kuala Lumpur at that time, with his permission. It was published by the CDD priests. The CDD is a religious congregation that's called the Congregation of the Disciples of the Lord. So they published this rite to allow for this rite to be used in Malaysia from the early 2000s. So I think that this is the earliest documented memory we have of how this rite came in, at least officially. Unofficially, I'm not sure. Okay. And the purpose of allowing for this rite to be celebrated in Malaysia was actually very clear. The purpose was to evangelize the people through inculturation.
To
evangelize the people through inculturation. Inculturation basically means you are using the culture of the people to help them to connect with the gospel. Right? That means making the gospel relevant to the people in such a way that because the gospel is incarnated to them in a way that's familiar to them through their culture, they are able to identify with it, they are able to accept it, rather than seeing it as something that comes in from foreign people or in a way that's alien to them. So that action of incarnating the gospel through the way of life of the people, that's called inculturation. So this purpose of allowing for this rite is very important. Because when we understand why this rite was allowed in Malaysia, then it helps us to position our discussion. That means the issue to discuss is not so much about the rite itself, but rather about how far this rite has effectively contributed to the evangelizing mission of the church. If the purpose of allowing this rite is to actually help people to connect with the gospel, then it's not so much the rite itself that should be discussed, but how far this rite has been effectively, or rather evangelization has been more effective as a result of allowing this rite. But before we continue with this discussion, right, I think something very important needs to be clarified. We have to get this thing out of the way. There is this elephant in the room, Everybody is wondering, is this rite of ancestral veneration an idolatrous act? Is it an act of idolatry? And I think the reason why many people have reacted towards it is because they equate it to idolatry. Okay? So I think it has to be clarified. Pope Pius XII was very clear. He clarified that honoring our ancestors by bowing to tablets with inscriptions of their names, or even to tablets that have their photographs, is permissible as long as we have no intention to worship them. So it has been clarified already, and that means we are allowing this right in the church, all right, as long as it is understood that we perform this right, not with the intention to worship.
Okay, then this comes a very interesting question, right? I think many Catholics probably know, but for clarity's sake for this discussion, what is the difference between worshipping and venerating? You know, our Protestant brothers and sisters, sometimes they ask us the question, why do we worship Mother Mary? And the usual response from us Catholics is, we don't worship Mother Mary, we venerate her. So what is the difference between worshipping and venerating?
Yeah, well, I suppose I can understand I can understand the concern of many of our Protestant brothers and sisters, on this matter, of course, because that's where I came from too, you see. Because, in the Protestant way of practice, praying and worshipping have no difference, To pray is to worship. To worship is to pray.
Okay.
No difference, all right? But in Catholic understanding, although worship involves prayer, praying does not necessarily mean worshipping. All right? Because we pray to the saints, yes, we also pray to God, but they are two different kinds of relationships. And in fact, the Catholic Church has very clear demarcations for them, When it comes to the saints, our relationship with them is what the church calls dulia. Dulia means reverence, a very deep respect. And for Mother Mary, because we respect her even more than the other saints, we hyper-dulia her. Hyper, you know what's hyper, right? Hyperactive means very, very, very active. So we respect the saints, we venerate them, but we hyper-dulia Mother Mary. Very, 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 very respect her. Right? But when it comes to God, the word that's used is latria. And latria is a word that can only be attributed to God. It's worship. And actually, to add to the confusion, in Old English, last time, the word worship could be used in both directions. Even for veneration, you could also use the word worship, although now it's not used anymore, So it added on to the confusion, you see. But actually, as far as the church is concerned, latria dulia and hyperdulia are totally different things from latria.
Okay.
So the difference in our relationship with the saints, including Mother Mary, and with God is a difference in the quality of relationship, not in the level. It's not with the saints, we dulia, and then with God, we latria. It's not something that's higher. No, it's one direction, dulia. Honor, veneration, respect, deep respect, right? But it never crosses over into worship. But with God, it's a totally different thing. It's worship. All right. So when we speak about this rite of ancestral veneration, it is definitely not latria, which is reserved only for God. It is dulia. All right. So I think it's important and fair to clarify that for people who think that this rite is an act of idolatry, it is proper that we clarify that this is not an act of worship. It is an act of veneration. All right. Just because we bow when we worship God doesn't mean that every time you bow, you are worshiping. I mean, most of us who are going to be watching this podcast are Malaysians. You know very well, when you are faced with royalty, you stand in front of royalty in Malaysia, what should you do? You better bow or else. And when you bow before the royalty, no one will say, why are you worshipping the ruler? No, because we know that bowing is a sign of respect. But when we stand before God and we worship, what do? We bow. So just because I bow to God doesn't mean that when I bow to anyone else, I'm worshiping the person, right? So I think that has to be clarified. I will not engage in any kind of debate with anyone on whether this act is idolatrous or not, because I think it has been very sufficiently clarified in our documents, whatever documents came from the Pope or even in the rite that has been allowed to be published in Malaysia. It is not an act of idolatry, and the intention is not to worship our ancestors. The intention is very clearly to venerate, to show respect, a very deep respect for our ancestors. Right? So the question I think that is more pertinent is how beneficial is this action or is this right? That's all. But not whether this right is qualitatively an idolatrous act of worship or not. So, in thinking about this, then, there are certain points that I think need further reflection. Yeah.
Okay, so actually I bumped into this Chinese New Year Thanksgiving missal, so I'm not sure if it's the same missal that's still being used now.
Yeah, it's probably the same one because there is only one.
But I also didn't check when was it published, because you mentioned that it's likely that it came into Malaysia around the 2002s onwards. But I found this excerpt here. I'll read it for you. It says that the Chinese place great importance on filial piety, which is what you mentioned, Lakan. So commemoration to the ancestors is an important ritual during the Chinese New Year celebration. Honoring the ancestors on the first day of the New Year is a way of fulfilling our filial piety. It is a tradition of our church to offer special prayers to our departed loved ones during Mass. So here clearly it states that it doesn't say that we're worshipping our ancestors and all these things, but I am Chinese, but I didn't know that the commemoration to the ancestors during Chinese New Year is important to fulfill our filial piety. I mean, I've never practiced this before, maybe some of the Catholic Chinese do. But also, as far as I'm concerned, we offer prayers for our departed loved ones during, say, All Souls Day Mass, and for example, or even part of the general intercessions or the prayer of the faithful during Mass. So why do we need such a special practice during Chinese New Year? Is this for the sake of inculturation or? Yeah,
I suppose it's for inculturation. At least that's what's mentioned in the documents. But yeah, I think when it comes to inculturation, it obliges us, people who are trying to inculturate, to ask some very important questions. And as I think about this, I think there are three important questions we need to ask about this, or three considerations that we need to think about or reflect on when it comes to this practice of ancestral veneration in our own context. All right, we are not talking about China anymore. Now we are talking about this practice being carried out in our own place in Malaysia. All right. So the first question that we have to ask is this rite or practice beneficial to the cause of the gospel? Because that's the whole purpose of inculturation, right?
Yes.
The whole purpose of inculturation is to make the gospel, help the gospel to connect with the people, right? So is it actually helping people to connect better to the gospel? I think that's a very important question. Why do I say that it's an important question? Because actually, many of the Chinese in Malaysia, well, at this stage, the vast majority of Chinese in Malaysia, we are diaspora Chinese, right? Diaspora here means that although yes, we had our ancestors coming from China, we have no memory of any life in China, right? We were born here. And in fact, our culture is so different from the culture of the people in ancient China. Well, our culture is so different from the people in China today, let alone the people of ancient China. Right? There is very little actually about us that is purely Chinese. I mean, look at the kind of food that we eat. Look at the way we speak our languages on a daily basis, right? Chinese is not even the first language for many of us. So when it comes to this issue of inculturation, I'm wondering, for us, people like us who are diaspora Chinese, or diaspora Chinese Catholics.
Mm.
The reason that in China this practice was instituted and allowed is because it was a daily, habitual way of life for them to venerate the ancestors daily in the homes.
Yep.
But for us, I don't think we have this practice as a way of life. You know, I've never had an ancestral tablet in my home, and I never knew. In my grandmother's home there was an ancestral tablet, but I never paid any attention to it.
Mm.
You know, and this one is like very old generation, you know, of people. I think many of the new generation of people, even if they are not Christians and they are Malaysian Chinese, many of them will not have ancestral tablets at home.
Mm.
So, you know, when we say that we are inculturating, in what way is this actually the culture of the people? I think we have to think about it in that way. All right. Although the published rite says that this rite is beneficial for non-Christians who may visit the Catholic Church for Chinese New Year masses, most non-Christian Chinese themselves today don't do it anymore either. So if the purpose is inculturation, is this still even a part of our culture? You know, I'm not saying yes or no, but I think that it's a sociological question that needs to be answered in order for us to know whether this rite continues to be beneficial to the cause of the gospel. All right. Yeah. What is clear is that this practice in our churches has scandalized many people. Yeah. But what is unclear is whether it has brought many people closer to the gospel. That we don't know yet, right?
Yeah.
And we haven't actually done a survey.
This comes to mind for me as well. I was thinking around the same along the same lines. Because at the end of the day, is this really done with the intention to bring the gospel to the people? And if yes, then why do people feel scandalized when this practice is introduced, right? And not the other way around, where the termination of these rights when for the people in China, then they feel scandalized.
Right. So it's the other way around, you know.
It felt that way to me.
Yeah. In China, when they didn't allow it, it was scandalous to the people.
Yes.
Here, when we institute it, it becomes scandalous to some people. And I remember there was this man who was non-Christian, a Chinese who was non-Christian, a Malaysian Chinese, non-Christian, and even he as a non-Christian was scandalized. And he asked me this question: who gave you people the right to appropriate our practices? You know? So who gives you the right to appropriate our practice and to baptize it in a new meaning, you know? To attribute a new meaning to it. In other words, you are corrupting what is our practice, you know. And they say it's very offensive, you know. So that kind of thing, so and I'm not just coming up with certain imaginary questions, you know, or interrogations, you know. These are cases of people that have communicated with me before, and that's what got me thinking. You see, I mean, when we talk about inculturation, right? Inculturation is something that has to be so natural, so subtle, that it doesn't actually cause reactions among people because the thing is so natural to them. One example, I don't know whether you've seen this before, but the Indian Catholic community in West Malaysia, we have a very big Indian population of Catholics, right? There is something that they have done all these years that I personally have always found very beautiful. You know, in the Hindu tradition, in the Hindu religion, when people enter into the Hindu temples, at the threshold of the temples, right, they will remove their footwear.
Okay.
Sometimes you pass by the Hindu temples, you will see, you know, at the threshold, at the entrance, at the door, a lot of footwear, you know, shoes and slippers all over, you know. Now, many Indians today are Catholics. And I have found that very naturally, many of our Indian brothers and sisters, very naturally, when they come to church for Mass, they will take off their slippers or take off their shoes. Naturally, no one tells them to do it. It's just something that they do. And many of our Indian priests, before they celebrate Mass, they will remove their footwear and they will celebrate Mass at the altar barefooted.
This is interesting.
No one makes an issue of it. No one even talks about it. No one has pointed it out to me before. But it's because in West Malaysia, I'm surrounded by many brothers and sisters who are Indian culture. It just happens so naturally. It's such a natural expression on their part that it doesn't have to be taught or no one tells them to do it. It's just a natural expression. And to me, that is enculturation. It's something that doesn't become an issue because it's so much at the heart of how they express their reverence for God.
So this
That
is a good example of enculturation then.
Yeah, to me lah, all right? So if evangelization is the purpose of this rite of ancestral veneration, then we have to ask this question: has this experiment been effective in our Malaysian context lah? And if it is, then why are people reacting towards it? All right. And if it is not helpful, then why are we continuing with it? And who are we actually doing it for?
Yes.
We have to ask this question because if we are not careful, we end up actually doing these things just to shock sendiri, right? And the whole purpose of enculturation is not to shock sendiri. It's to help people to connect with the gospel through their culture. So are people actually connecting with the gospel through their culture by instituting this rite lah? So these are things that we have to answer very honestly, I suppose, And if we are really serious about it, I think we actually have to do a social scientific survey. Do a survey among the Chinese in, say, West Malaysia, since this is where the practice is prevalent. Do a survey. Ask them, what do you think about this practice? Do you think it's beneficial? Does it help you to love God more? Does it help you to connect better to the gospel that is proclaimed by the church? You see? Then, whatever answer comes, we study it and understand why lah.
It is interesting that you brought this up. Oh, sorry to interrupt. It's just that it's on my mind now, and I have a very short memory, so I accidentally interrupt you. But since we're here, because it's interesting, because when you talk about having a survey and then see whether this experiment actually works, I'm not sure if you heard, but as I was researching on this enculturation thing, right, I bumped into an article on enculturation in Vietnam, right, and this they actually okay, I didn't print the whole document here, but this document, they said in the article, the document composed by Catholic experts in culture and customs over 5 years allows Catholics to bow down, offer incense, and show other formal expressions before dead people, regardless of their faith, as a sign of respecting the dead and expressing their faith in the resurrection of Christ. So here very clearly it says that these are Catholic experts in culture and customs, and they've written this document over 5 years. They actually have done a survey, and they clearly say that to me it sounds like an enculturation because as a sign of respecting the dead and expressing their faith in the resurrection of Christ. It's not shock sendiri. They put the the expression of faith in the resurrection of Christ, and then. So I just wonder, right, for this particular ancestral veneration in Malaysia, did we have Catholic? I just wonder, you probably don't know. So because we are talking about the sociology of it, isn't it? Yeah. Did we have Catholic experts in the culture and customs involved? Because I cannot find in the Chinese New Year Thanksgiving Missal, nor anywhere else, any mention of expressing our faith in Christ for this practice, particularly in Malaysia. And no mention of incorporating these practices into, what I mean is for the Vietnam. In Vietnam, they actually did not mention about incorporating these practices into liturgy. Whereas for us, I see that they're incorporating this practice after the concluding rites, I believe, if I read the Missal correctly. So how does this practice in Malaysia bring the gospel to the people? We come back to this question, isn't it? Yeah.
Well, in the first place, right, there is the rite that is published by the CDD. All right. But I have also seen, I myself have been in a mass where the rite was not practiced as is published. According to the rite that's published, right, this rite should take place after the end of the mass and the final blessing.
That's right, yes.
Right. But I have been in a mass where this rite of ancestral veneration took place in the middle of the mass. Yeah. So it's not always followed to the letter, even if this rite has been published as such. But you are right. I think if you are referring to that document or that allowance that was issued by the Bishops' Conference based on the study that was done by their social scientific experts there, Yes, that document doesn't talk about how this rite is allowed or instituted in the context of the liturgy. It talks about how people should be allowed to continue with this practice in the confines of their own private space. So this is another thing that of course we will have to discuss. It's another one of the 3 points that I think need to be considered.
Are we on your first point still? Sorry.
Let me think. I think I can comfortably wrap up the first point, about how useful the institution of this rite is to the cause of the gospel. We need to think about this issue, and if we really, really are serious about wanting this as a practice of enculturation, then we have to engage social scientists into it, because theologians alone are not enough. We can think about it theologically, yes. I mean, many things can be incorporated into the church and then explained or justified theologically as an afterthought, But if we are talking about enculturation in such a way that it helps people to connect in a closer way with the gospel, then we have to engage people who are culture experts. That means social scientists who study, anthropologists, people who study the experiences, the cultural experiences of people, and how people perceive them, how people practice them on a daily basis. And these social scientists would be able to actually help us to do a research among the people to find out how they actually feel or think about this practice as part of their Catholic life, right?
But then I have another question, practice is one thing, but why, at the end of the day, why is this even necessary to be done on the sanctuary? Is this done on the sanctuary? Can it not be done in the confines of their home at the end of the day?
Yeah. You see, you notice that it seems to me like your concern keeps gravitating towards liturgical concerns.
Yes, that's right.
And if you look at the social media, a lot of the things that people are saying, I think, show the same thing. It shows the same kind of concern. So we will come to this but I suppose I'll quickly wrap up this first thing that I'm talking about in terms of the usefulness of this practice, enculturating this practice into the life of the church. Very often it is justified based on practices in Taiwan, saying that since it was useful for enculturation in Taiwan, therefore it's useful for enculturation for us. I think any social scientist will be able to tell you that effective enculturation in one place does not tantamount to effective enculturation in another different context. So the two contexts have to be studied separately. So I'm speaking about this purely from a scholarly viewpoint. Okay, so like I said, I don't represent the magisterium. I don't represent what the bishops say, but we are talking about a social scientific study of how effective this action of enculturation is in the local context. All right. In the first place, we don't even know whether this rite, incorporating this rite into the life of the Catholics in Taiwan, has actually been successful in the promotion of the gospel there. Do we have any idea? We don't. Let alone how successful it has been here. All right. So in fact, in the light of the reactions to this practice on social media, every single Chinese New Year, we must seriously ask if the practice is actually causing scandal in our local context. Okay. Now, obeying the fourth commandment to honor our parents. Yes, we must honor our parents. We must honor our ancestors, right? But does the commandment have in mind a practice that may lead to misperceptions on other people's part that the first commandment has been undermined?
Fair point. That's a very good point.
Yeah. So, of course, if people do think that way, it's wrong to think that way. All right. But nevertheless, is it necessary that we must perform this action that will cause that misperception? Yes, it is a misperception, but that misperception was provoked by our action.
Yes.
So, is it necessary? the line between veneration and idolatry is a very fine one in many people's minds. So is there a possibility that in enculturating, we are not being cautious or prudent enough? All right. After all, prudence is the most important virtue, right? Yeah. Okay. So then now I think since you keep gravitating towards the liturgical aspect, right? The second thing that we need to think about is the liturgical considerations.
Okay.
One major concern, it's true, that many people have is how this rite has been brought into our common liturgical space. You see, if it was something that people are doing at home in the privacy of their own family space, that's a different matter. And that's precisely what was allowed in ancient China. All right. But now, the reason that it's bringing about all this reaction is because the rite is taking place in our common liturgical space.
Yes.
So bringing this rite into our common liturgical space has stirred up a whole set of new concerns. Because in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, right? Let's talk about the Catechism of the Catholic Church. It talks about these practices under the category of popular piety, things like what we are doing, veneration of the saints and things like that, right? Prayers that we say to the saints, right? Asking for the intercessions. These are all categorized in the Catechism as popular piety. They are not liturgical action, So popular piety and liturgy are different things, So at best, this practice that we are talking about, ancestral veneration, is a practice that equals only practices such as veneration of relics, visit to shrines and sanctuaries, pilgrimages, processions, stations, praying the Stations of the Cross, religious dances, praying the Rosary, and using religious medals or miraculous medals, things like this. And all these practices, right, are actually done where? In the Mass or outside the Mass?
Outside the Mass.
Outside the Mass, because they are practices of popular piety. You see? So, if we are talking about popular piety, then it has to be something that's separate from the Mass. But the thing is, when it is done in the same place where the Mass is being celebrated or was being celebrated just a moment ago, it invokes or provokes certain feelings in people. And I think that is a problem. It's the space in which this thing takes place. That partly contributes to the controversy, right? Some clergy have actually called this rite of ancestral veneration a Chinese sacramental. But that's his own term. That's their own term for it, because there is no such thing as a Chinese sacramental. All right. The church is a universal church. An object or a gesture is either a sacramental, which is instituted by the church, or it is not. So as far as the church is concerned, not everything can be considered a sacramental just because it is felt that this thing is helpful for people's devotional purpose. Right? So the appropriate category for this practice of ancestral veneration is popular piety. Right? Now, there is also, I think many of our lay people may not know that besides the Catechism of the Catholic Church and our Roman Missal and our general instruction of the Roman Missal, all these documents that are very popular even among the lay people, many lay people, I think, do not know that there is also a directory that was promulgated by the Holy See on popular piety and the liturgy, giving principles and guidelines on how popular piety is to be practiced. And interestingly, right, this directory was issued by the Holy See at around the same time that this rite of ancestral veneration was instituted in Malaysia, also in the early 2000s.
The 2000s? Okay.
Yeah. Okay, and now it does say, okay, let me have a look at this directory. Yeah, okay. There's one part of this directory that says this deeply rooted cultural elements connoting particular anthropological concepts are to be found among the customs and usages connected with the cult of the dead among some peoples. So it's talking about the practice of venerating the dead, All right. Now, these often spring from a desire to prolong family and social links with the departed. Now, then this part of the directory says, great caution must be used in examining and evaluating these customs. Great caution. You know, it cannot be just applied without much thinking and reflection, you know. It says care should be taken to ensure that they are not contrary to the gospel. Yes. And likewise, care should be taken to ensure that they cannot be interpreted as pagan residues. So yes, we can say at this point of time that it has been clarified that this rite does not contradict the gospel. But could it be that the reactions that we see towards this practice stems from it having been interpreted as pagan residue? Right? And of course, you have also raised a very important question, a very important liturgical question, right? As Catholics, are we not already praying for the dead at every Mass? And don't we also already have special Masses where we honor our ancestors in the faith who have lived faithful Christian lives on the Feast of All Saints? And we also pray for those who are in purgatory on the Feast of All Souls. So for some people, I think they will be thinking about it in terms of why we would need a rite of ancestral veneration in addition to all this. Does it not give an impression that our prayers in the Mass are inadequate and therefore need to be further supplemented by these rites that actually are quite alien to our Catholic patrimony? You know? So again, more questions than answers, but there are things that I personally do think that we need to think about very carefully.
Okay.
So the issue here is not so much of right and wrong, but prudence. What is more pastorally prudent? I think that is the main question.
Yeah, talking about that directory promulgated by the Holy See, is that right? So would it be fair to say that this, although it's not directed specifically on ancestral veneration, but it's sort of what the Church says about similar practices on an official note?
Yeah, well, it doesn't talk specifically about ancestral veneration as such, but it does talk about the cult of the dead. It means the practice of, in some way, honoring the people who have died, you know, and that's precisely what the rite of ancestral veneration is about. Yeah.
So the Church did say something about
it does say something about it. Yeah, and so the two things, you see, the two conditions that it gives are that firstly, care should be taken to ensure that this practice is not contrary to the gospel. Secondly, care should be taken to ensure that this practice cannot be interpreted as pagan residues.
Residuals, that's right.
And it's at this second point that I think hits a raw nerve among many people, because I think they are interpreting it as pagan residue. The question is not a matter of whether these people are right or wrong in interpreting it as pagan residue, you know.
Okay.
It's not a matter of whether they are right or wrong for thinking that. It's a matter of whether our action is actually provoking this misperception on their part, and whether it's a necessity or not. Is it necessary for us to do this and in the process causing them to misinterpret? And therefore maybe placing a hindrance of their acceptance of the gospel. The other way around, you know, it backfires. The intention initially was so that they will draw closer to the gospel, but because of what we do, it causes them to draw further away from the gospel. You know, from the perspective of the Church, it would be wrong for us to say, that's their problem lah. They are not clever enough to understand it. It's their problem. We can't say that.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. You know, in fact, actually, I Googled, because I was looking for images, right? And I Googled these two words, ancestral Catholic. And then the top images, right, are all the bowing to the ancestral tablet or holding joss sticks at the sanctuary. And from what I see, they all look like Malaysian, you know. And then I said, okay, maybe it's the Google algorithm, right? Because I'm in Malaysia, they give me only images from Malaysia. But so I started Googling images. I added a third word, Taiwan. So I Googled ancestral Catholic Taiwan, these three words, the same images
What came out?
similar.
Malaysian images.
I remember I didn't see, for me, it didn't look like Taiwan still. So I may be wrong, but I just that's where I started to wonder, does that mean that Taiwan don't practice this as much as us, or that the people there are not feeling scandalized like us with this practice, so there are not so many these kind of images? It just begs that question. Like you say, more questions than answers.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just wanting to share when, as a curious laity, I didn't know about the directory. So what I do, I Google lah.
Kepo.
Yeah lah. No, I don't know how to find directory promulgated by Holy See, so I Google image. Yeah, what is this? How come like that? Like that, loh. So that's why I wanted to talk about this topic today with you.
And I think you have hit on something very important, very pertinent lah. Maybe if not to the people in Borneo, at least to many of our Catholics in West Malaysia. It's a very important thing. And now that we are talking about a synodal church, right, where everybody's view and experience of the church matters, right? And we need to hear what the Holy Spirit is saying, not just through the clergy, but also through the laity. I think it's very opportune for us to using this platform of this rite of ancestral veneration, listen to what the people are telling us, or what the Holy Spirit is telling us, telling the church through the laity. And this brings me to my third reflection, third point that I think needs to be considered in thinking about this issue in a more holistic way, this issue of ancestral veneration. What is the role of the laity in the church actually? To what extent do the laity in the church have a say on such matters? Because many of our laity in the last 10 years have been putting on these pictures and putting all sorts of comments on social media. But has there been any proper forum for them, to voice what they think? I think everybody knows, of course, that on many matters in the church, the laity don't have a say, rightly or wrongly, all right? But I'm not talking about matters of faith and morals here, I'm talking about matters of non-essentials, like the rite of ancestral veneration. And I think on this issue, an issue like that can be treated with a spirit of charity on both sides, of those who are enforcing it as well as those upon whom it has been enforced. So is this practice of ancestral veneration a matter of dogma, or is it a matter of individual expression of piety? Which then, if it's just a matter of individual expression of piety, then it becomes an optional thing, because it's not a matter of faith, not a matter of dogma, right? So, do the sentiments of the laity on a matter like this mean anything or not, or do we go ahead and just institute it because we think that the laity are perpetually ignorant and will never understand anyway, so we just make them do it? Like in the olden days, we just say, the laity don't know anything, so just make them pay, pray, and obey. You heard of that before?
No, this is my first time.
Very common saying, the job of the laity, because they don't know anything, just pay, support the church's mission, give money, pay, pray, and obey. But I think the time has passed for the laity to be consigned to this kind of role, right? They are thinking people. Yes, they may not be people who are very formed in the field of theological studies, but that doesn't mean they have no idea what their faith stands for. They have their own language to express what they believe and how they believe it, right? So it's important for us to listen and to find a way to translate what it is that they are trying to tell us. Yeah. So, and I think, again, this goes back also to the importance of the work of the social scientists. This is precisely why I'm working very closely with a lot of social scientists now, because just functioning as a theologian alone in the current modern world is totally inadequate. Without the help of social scientists to help us to understand, to interpret what's going on, we will never be able to give a proper theological response, let alone a pastoral response to a lot of these cultural, socio-political, economic issues that are taking place. So these are the three things that I think we need to think about, the effectiveness of this enculturation, in terms of the course of the gospel. Secondly, the liturgical considerations of it. Performing this rite in a common liturgical space, and in the process, also offending some people who may think that this is not the right place for it. That kind of thing, lah. And how they interpret this action, whether it's they see it as a pagan residue. And then the third thing, the role of the laity in the church. Are the laity worth listening to? Are their views on this matter worth our effort listening to?
Yeah, definitely a lot of points to ponder on from what we discussed today. But before we conclude the episode for today, could you perhaps give some general advice or remarks on this issue of veneration of ancestors?
General advice. Do we have another hour? Okay. I would say to my fellow brothers and sisters who are Catholics, well, first of all, please don't misunderstand that I am against honoring the memory of our ancestors. Right? That would be silly, of course. But you'll notice that I have more questions than answers on this matter. Because for me, this matter is not a matter upon which I should impose my opinion or how I personally, subjectively feel about it. It's not. It's a matter that requires social scientific study and research if we are serious about it, to help us derive a proper conclusion, to know how the grassroots feel about it at the level of the ground. Why?
Definitely.
Because it is not a matter of an essential to the faith. So we need to understand how they feel about it, right? Because popular piety always comes from the ground, you see? So that's the nature of popular piety. Otherwise, it will not be called popular piety. So is this so-called practice of popular piety actually popular? The social scientists will have to tell us that, all right? Proponents of this practice may be right that it is probably not a question of permissibility. They will tell you what is wrong with doing this. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. But we also know that this practice is not Catholic religious practice. It is not a part of Catholic tradition. And therefore, people should not be compelled to participate against their conscience if they feel so. All right? There is also the issue of how it is interpreted by the public and what its effect is on people's perception of the gospel. I've really explained this very thoroughly, I think.
Yes.
Right? For us, who are Chinese, we may think that this is purely cultural practice. But do the original practitioners think so? Do they think that it's purely cultural? How do they feel about us appropriating their traditions? Are we being sensitive to them or not? Because if we are not careful, what we do could be construed as disrespect, right? And it does seem right now that there are those who feel insulted that we are doing this in our churches.
It comes back to that word that you keep bringing up, the word prudence.
Yes, prudence. Yeah. I call to mind St. Paul in his first letter to the Corinthians. He says, everything is permissible. Maybe so, but not everything does good. True, everything is permissible, but not everything builds people up. There are many things in the Christian life that are okay to do, but that doesn't mean that these things are beneficial. Right? So St. Paul himself says that, right? So that's one thing. The other thing also is, I think it's not a good idea for us to okay, this one is purely my opinion, if you like. All right. It doesn't represent the opinion of the church or any bishop or any priest. All right.
Okay,
but I personally think that it is not a good idea to practice this rite in the sanctuary. Although, yes, I'm aware that it is found, it is prescribed in the rite of that was promulgated or published by the CDDs. Yes, I'm aware that it is prescribed there in that rite, right? That it can take place in the sanctuary. But perhaps it is not a very good idea. It is probably better to do it in a parish hall, which is a more neutral space. All right, so that it becomes an optional rite. And when it becomes an optional rite, then it is not so scandalous. I'm approaching this from the perspective that this is a question of wisdom, not a question of truth.
Okay.
It's a question of wisdom. Like I said, prudence. You have rightly pointed that out. All right. Now, how about in terms of participation? Should we participate in it when it is instituted that way? After Mass, we are there for the Chinese New Year Mass, and then after that, it seems as though because we are at that Mass, and it takes place in that liturgical space, we are compelled to participate in it. Should we? Must we? Well, I would say that if you think that your conscience cannot allow you to participate in it, then don't. The right thing to do, I feel, would be to follow your conscience. Don't let anyone make you feel guilty for wanting to participate in it or not wanting to participate in it. Right? Remember that this rite is not a part of our deposit of faith. What makes us Catholic is the fact that we all appeal to and embrace the same deposit of faith. But this rite is not part of the deposit of faith, and we shouldn't pretend that it is. So rejecting this rite does not make you less Catholic, and wanting to practice it doesn't make you more Catholic than the person who doesn't want to.
So that I was saying earlier also that reminds me of what you mentioned earlier on the Indians taking off their shoes before going into church. That is very natural for them, right? And it's not like they are asking everyone else to do it just because they're doing it. Right.
Even for those who do wear shoes into the pews, or those priests who continue wearing their footwear when they celebrate the Mass, they are not being judged to be less Catholic or less pious by those who want to take off their footwear. So, since it's an act of piety, and it is an act of kind of popular piety, you may say, it's left entirely to the individual. If this is what you want to do, because it helps you to show reverence in a better way to God, it helps you to connect with the message of the gospel or with your act of worship, then go ahead and do it. But for those who don't do it, it doesn't make them less Catholic, right? So I think it's a very important principle for us, for both sides, those who want to practice it and those who don't want to practice it, to respect. Don't let anyone tell you also that if you refuse to participate in this rite, you are injuring the visible unity of the church community. As if in order for unity, everyone must do the same thing. This rite has absolutely no effect on our Catholic unity, because our unity is not found in the popular piety that we perform. Our unity is found in the Eucharist. And even so, even in the reception of the Eucharist, it cannot be made compulsory, right? You cannot force people to receive communion when they do not feel that they are in the right state to receive it. So what more such non-religious rites,
That's right.
So, well, for me, I myself personally, I do not want to practice this rite, right? Because to me, it is not an innate part of my cultural expression. This is not where I came from. And I did not become Catholic for this. I'm Chinese, yes, but that does not mean that I'm from Asian China. Or rather, what I mean is, it does not mean that I'm from ancient China. I'm Malaysian Chinese. And I'm Chinese in a very different way from the way people in ancient China used to be. Right? Yeah. And of course, it's not the job of the church to teach me how to become more Chinese or to make me more Chinese. The duty of the church is to save me, to make Christ my focus, not my ancestors. And I don't say this disrespectfully. I respect the memory of my ancestors, but with all due respect, it's not the job of the church to tell me how I should show piety to my ancestors in a subjective way. The job of the church is to make Christ my focus, to worship him, to love him more dearly. Not everything that we do in the Catholic Church is Catholic in character. For example, during our church events, we eat a lot, but that does not make eating a religious action. And we wouldn't force people to eat if they didn't want to eat. So it's the same thing for this rite. If you think that this rite draws you closer in your love for God, it draws you closer to what the gospel actually means, then go ahead lah. But if you do not think that it helps you in any way, or you do not think that it is an authentic expression of your culture, the way it is being practiced on a daily basis, then refrain from it. It's up to you. I mean, we are not talking about the sacraments. We are not talking about the deposit of faith. We are not talking about faith and morals. It's popular piety. Some people pray the rosary. Some people pray the Divine Mercy Chaplet. Some people pray the prayer to Saint Michael the Archangel. Some people do the novena to the Holy Spirit, and others don't. So some venerate the ancestors through this rite, and others don't.
Yeah. So would it be fair to say that this whole... Oh, sorry. Go on.
ahead.
No, I was just saying, would it be fair to say that this whole thing, right, it's of conscience and prudence at the end of the day?
Yeah, I suppose so. Yeah lah. But yeah, terrible lah. I took so long to explain all these things, and then you just summarized it in 2 words. Like, I should have said this right from the beginning, that yeah, it's all about this at the end of the day. But you are right.
But then again, if you just say conscience and prudence 2 words, then people don't understand the context of it, right? Then we create even more questions than answers. So do you have anything else to add on? Yeah.
I can't think of anything anymore lah. But I suppose these are the aspects lah, that I think need further thinking when it comes to this rite. And perhaps the reason that it has provoked so much reaction over the last so many years, every time Chinese New Year comes, is because these aspects are not properly examined theologically, pastorally, social, scientifically. I think if we were just more sensitive about it, we would be able to give a more thoughtful response to how it is being carried out.
Well, definitely a lot to think about, especially as you just mentioned, theologically, pastorally, and from the social aspect, right? But other than that, thank you very much, Deacon, for spending some time to share your thoughts.
Have I answered what your concerns were about this issue?
Oh, definitely answered a lot of my concerns. But I think a lot of what we discussed, I would need time to digest, as I think many people watching this podcast would also might feel so. Because there's a lot of things that we have to think about, right? It's not so simple like a conscience and prudence summary, but to think about, for example, the directory promulgated by the Holy See, that's what the church officially says. Does Taiwan really still practice it? How come it's scandalizing the Catholic Malaysians, even the non-Christians for that matter? So many things to think about. And
I think the issue is a very nuanced one, and it requires a lot of reflection and honesty, as well as goodwill on both sides. I find that on this matter, on both sides, those who impose it and who insist that it must be practiced, as well as on those who reject it. On both sides, I think there are people who have been guilty of minimalizing the issue and simply oversimplifying it. But it's not such a simple issue. It requires a lot of thinking, reflection from all these different perspectives that I've identified. And I might even have missed out some of those other important perspectives. But it requires a lot of thinking. Yeah.
I think, would it be fair to say that perhaps one of the questions that we can keep thinking about is that whether this practice is beneficial to the gospel? Because at the end of the day, this rite was supposedly introduced and inculturated to bring the gospel closer to people.
Right.
So I think if this whole podcast is confusing people, perhaps this is the one question we can think about. I was about to say that from a theological, pastoral, and social perspective, but that's just complicating things. But yes, is this right? Is this right at the end of the day? Really bringing the gospel closer to people. Of course, we can't quantify it because we don't have social experts to give out surveys and all these things. But that is one question.
We need the social experts, the social scientists to step in and to do their job.
That's right. So if anything, I think that's the one question that I would be thinking about personally. And then I will also slowly digest the rest.
This is a very good starting point. A good point to start with in thinking more about this issue.
And I think the other Sorry. So the other important thing to note is, as you mentioned, there's no right or wrong. It's not saying no right or wrong. It's not about the truth, but the wisdom, right? So yeah lah, I can go on and on about what's running in my mind. But so again, thank you so much for spending your time sharing your thoughts with us, Deacon.
Welcome.
So if you like what you're watching, subscribe to our Splendour Project YouTube channel to keep updated, and do keep an eye out for our next episode, and we will see you then. Thank you and God bless. Cheers.
See you.
Bye-bye.